Has anyone heard from Charlie?
They dropped.
Well, I know John is video watching. Then he's here. All right, so I guess that's about it then. All right. All right, so today we are going over some literature I've provided that goes with Book 2 of the Confessions. Some highlights, we've got the Genesis story of the forbidden fruits, which is meant to help you see the contrast and the deliberate, frankly, comparison between Genesis and what Augustine is doing in Book 2. Then we've got a selection from, frankly, what I consider to be the weirdest thing I've ever read. And that's saying something. I've read a lot of weird things. But Plotinus's Aeneas, which is the Neoplatonist, literature that Augustine would have been most familiar with, is an important backdrop to what's going on in a lot of the Confessions. Not just Book 2, but I do think certain corners of Book 2 are very explicit and direct in their use of Neoplatonic ideas. And then something that might be a little more familiar, Plato's Symposium, which of course is Plato's classic treatment of the idea of love, where he claims that the best kind of eros is completely immaterial and based in Platonic friendship of investigating thoughts together. All right, so Book 2. First, the literature accompanying Book 2, rather. Initial questions, initial thoughts, impressions. What did you see? What was of interest? What was bizarre?
One thing I thought was interesting was because last class Eric brought up the passage about the enemy, whether or not that's his own struggles or actual reference to the devil. And I remember it was saying about being crushed underfoot by the enemy of his own struggles. And it made me think of the passage in Genesis where the serpent's being crushed under man's heel.
Yeah, no, that's a good catch. In fact, I should have thought of that immediately. If Genesis, if the original chapters of Genesis 2 and 3 are in mind in this section, and they definitely are, with the imagery of the forbidden fruits, the imagery of being crushed under something. There is that reference in Genesis chapter 3. So, no, I think you're right, and that makes it sound like it's a reference to demonic powers, the devil, Satan, rather than whatever the alternative interpretation I gave the other day, because that is the immediate context. So good catch. Yes, that's a great observation.
One thing I want to bring up is when Augustine is talking about his sin he committed with his friends as a worse sin than the original sin, in that when he kind of later gives a valid reasoning behind the sin for the camaraderie, that I'm still like hung up. Does he still, after he says that, does he still believe it is a worse sin than the forbidden fruit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, he doesn't sort of circle back on that, but he is satisfied, at least in this sense. There is a school of ancient psychology that basically says this: every action has to have a perceived good in mind. You know, the idea is nobody intentionally harms themselves. So let's say I'm a cigarette smoker and I'm hooked on these things. And my doctor says, you're going to die of lung cancer if you keep this up. Nobody tries to die of lung cancer. The cigarette smoker has a good mind, and the good is the pleasure of the smoking of the cigarettes, the nicotine and stuff. And the idea is every human action has this kind of rationality behind it, that there is a good that is attempted to be accomplished. So why did he steal the fruit when he didn't have to, when he had access to fruit at home? Well, because the good he was pursuing wasn't the fruit, it was camaraderie with his buddies. So that fulfills, and so that makes the action not sort of insanely irrational. It still makes it irrational in that camaraderie with your buddies is less important than moral purity and virtue. So it's still a misordering of things. It's still irrational, but it's something his account of psychology can account for. And that kind of reasoning goes all the way back to Plato, that nobody intentionally does bad or chooses the bad, because to do so is to choose your own destruction. Nobody does that, not intentionally.
So, what about if someone kills himself?
Yeah. So, they have an answer for that. The idea is this: the good in mind is the elimination of pain. So nobody wants to kill themselves. What they want is the pain to stop. So the good in mind is relief from pain. And the idea is everything, can be traced to this sort of psychology. And that all sin, therefore, is a kind of overestimating of the value of the good. So pleasure is a good, money is a good, being free of pain is a good.
This is a totally different topic, but I haven't had any experience with Neoplatonism. Does that just, neo means new, so is it just a new wave of Platonic thought, or?
It's a revised version of Platonism. So it takes some of the ideas, it builds on them, it develops them in some way. So whenever you say neo, it means it's revised. So Neoplatonism, here I give what I think sort of metaphysically as the most important innovations from Neoplatonism on my introduction to Aeneid 5. And instead of the divided line, we have something that actually is kind of similar to Plato's divided line, but we see sort of a revised account of it. So why is there something rather than nothing, according to Neoplatonism? What is foundational, according to Neoplatonism? Well, the most real thing, according to Neoplatonism, is nous. And nous means pure intellect. It also, wait a second, wait. That's not even right. So the most foundational thing, rather, is oneness. The one, the foundational, oneness is basically being. And this is sort of the metaphysically foundational thing that is there underneath all of reality. What emanates from being is nous, which is intellect. And intellect is basically soul. And this might be something like the ultimate divine mind and ordering of the universe. This one, the foundational one, is ultimately beyond description. We can't even really say anything about it. Actually, I shouldn't use the word soul here because I'm about to use the word soul here. Then from nous, we get soul, and we get the universal soul, where we get a kind of pantheism. So there is soul behind all living things in the physical world. It is the sort of reality beyond nature. Then we get sort of physical nature, which is a combination of soul and matter. And finally, the least real, least important thing is prime matter, which is unshaped matter. And there is a lesser sort of reversion from each thing to its previous thing. So each of these sort of combine in a way. So nature is basically what gives shape to prime matter, and soul gives shape to nature. So this is kind of the weird metaphysics behind Neoplatonism. So it's a picture of sort of a universe in motion, and both on both ends, the ultimate foundational one and prime matter are both things that you can't say anything about on their own. This is the most good, most real thing, and these things are good and real as that. Everything here is good, but the most good thing and the most light thing are the things at the top. And you've got this sort of physical, immaterial cutoff where nature has an element of soul behind it and undergirding it, but nature itself is an expression of the physical. So the pure, better things are always the things on the top. So that is, that's Neoplatonism. So this should look a lot like Plato's divided line. So that's why it's Platonism, but it should look different and revised, which is why it's Neoplatonism. Does that help a little bit? Although, as I said, I mean, it's one of the stranger things I've read, and I've read a lot of strange things. Yeah, so for example, in the Confessions, we won't get Augustine's account of angels, but we will. But there is one of his writings where he talks about it, and he gives this exact image of angels being sort of individual aspects of universal soul that are inclined to move back towards their creator deity. So again, this is an image that really is very much behind certain corners of Augustine's thought, even if it's not always evidence. And that, of course, is why the physical is always sort of distrusted or looked down upon, is because it's further down the line. The better humans are kind of this weird part of nature where, we have soul, so we're inclined to sort of move back towards our better parts, our rational intellect, but yet we're physically embodied no matter what we do. We're kind of stuck with that. Which is why, sort of eroticism in general is going to be looked down upon because it's down here. But we have at least that potential to move towards the immaterial, to embrace our intellect, our virtue, and keep it in that direction. All right, good. Anything else? What other initial observations? Angel, did you have anything? Any thoughts?
Anything riveting?
Let's see. How about the symposium? What did you all think of Plato's symposium? That is both a more accessible, many people find it to be more accessible and more common, more familiar passage. Definitely more widely read than the Indians.
It definitely, especially the ideas like on ideal heavenly love and inferior bodily love are definitely reflected.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about, he said there's a light of chaste love versus the thought of lust.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one of the places where we see the Confessions reference the symposium. Yes.
What would Augustine say about the differences between the ultimate love of wisdom described in the Symposium compared to the ultimate love of God?
Yeah. In a certain sense, he, as I said before, he really likes the Platonists. He thinks that they're the most correct, most observant of any purely secular, non-revealed system. So he thinks that they're really onto something there. And by describing it not just as sort of admiration or friendship, but eros. Eros can translate as desire. It's our root word for things like erotic and eroticism. When Plato talks about love of the Symposium and love of wisdom, I think Augustine is going to say it approximates something like love of God. But of course, wisdom can't love you back. So wisdom isn't personal. So Augustine kind of looks at Plato and says, well, he did the best he could, and he did quite well, given that he didn't have the advantage of revelation. The fact that Plato correctly identifies that the sort of best aspect of the self, the best function of the self is to erotically desire some sort of connection with universal wisdom. He's going to say, not bad. It's not Christian. It's not Christianity, but Augustine, like many of the ancients, had a lot of respect for the schools that descended from Plato. All right, well, let's look at these sort of closely, one at a time. Let's look at the Genesis passage. Let's see. So in Genesis chapter 3, we see the central command in paradise is do not eat from the tree, specifically the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The first temptation in verse 4 is to basically assert that the fruit is good. By the way, this is believed by theologians, it's generally believed to be true, that the fruit of the tree is good, just context is bad. So Adam and Eve see that the fruit of the tree is good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom, and so the goodness of the fruit is generally attractive. It's just the sort of failure to observe the importance of observing the command in the context is considered to be the center of temptation. To believe, to seize what is immediately good in front of you, instead of holding to the good of faith in God and in the goodness of God. And then we've got the first passing of the buck, where Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpents, and nobody comes out of the story looking all that positively. So in contrast, when Augustine is considering the forbidden fruit of his neighbor's garden, one of the continued contrasts he makes is the fruit wasn't good. So in other words, he sort of has empathy and says he can understand how Adam and Eve can make the mistake they made, because they actually had good fruit. They actually had a attractive option in mind, whereas he himself was willing to do evil for something that was inferior to what he already had. So that's why he sort of obsesses about why did he steal the forbidden fruits. Yes?
Could Adam have eaten the forbidden fruit for camaraderie as well?
This is one of the interpretations of Genesis that is sometimes given. And on this interpretation, it's almost like, this is the interpretation, frankly, that tends to blame Eve more than Adam. And therefore, I don't particularly like this interpretation. But yes, so there is an interpretation that says, well, Adam saw that Eve was changed by the eating of the fruit, and he overvalued connection with Eve rather than following the command that he was given. Therefore, he ate for the sake of camaraderie with Eve. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything in the text that makes me think that the camaraderie was what Adam's choice was about. But yeah, it doesn't really say much about the husband's reasoning, Adam's reasoning. All we really have is the second half of verse 6. She also gave some of the fruit to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. A lot of interpretations focus on the clause "who was with her" to make it clear that Adam is present the whole time during the conversation of the serpent, and is therefore influenced by the conversation from the serpent. But to be blunt, as far as I can tell, there's some ambiguity there. In any case, it ain't good. I will note that many commentators think that God primarily blames Adam, which is why when God appears, the first person he singles out is Adam in verse 10. And then Adam passes on. So if we look at, and I quote this part in the introduction here, Augustine says, and this is in my introduction to the Genesis passage, "Yet had I a desire to commit robbery, and did so, compelled neither by hunger nor poverty through distaste for well-doing, and a lustiness of iniquity. For I pilfered that of which I already had sufficient amounts, and much better. Nor did I desire to enjoy what I pilfered, but to enjoy the theft and sin itself." So compared to, so why did Augustine do it? Augustine did his sin because he wanted to enjoy theft. Why did Eve and Adam eat the fruit? Well, because the fruit was good for food, a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desired for wisdom. So in Augustine's mind, his personal actions were were worse than the atoms, than the actions of Adam and Eve. All right, let's push on to the Aeneid. And the Aeneid is going to be obviously a less familiar text, but it's got some fantastic passages. Let's see which. All right, so some important words to understand the Aeneid. The idea of procession and emanation is the idea that one of the concepts on the Platinian account is the foundation for the other. So words like effusion, procession, those indicate the hard-lined arrows going down. So the one emanates, nous, or to say it differently, the nous proceeds from the one. So there is sort of an inherent motion and change in the metaphysical foundations of the universe. One of the sort of reasons why nous emanates from the one is that once you have intellect in some sense as distinct from the one, then intellect can contemplate itself and the one. And that ultimately is what Augustine is going to think the human purpose of life is. The human purpose of life is to contemplate our foundational source, which of course is God. So again, you can see that there is an analogous pattern of reasoning between Plotinus and Augustine. So once you have nous, soul proceeds from nous, and soul is sort of the more immediate foundation of the physical universe. None of these things occupy space and time. There's kind of a weird thing, but important to remember that which is in space and time is matter and nature. So there is an Augustinian thread of reasoning that echoes in theology to this day, the idea that God operates outside of time. So most Christians, when they say God is eternal, they don't just mean that God lives forever. What they mean is God operates and interacts with time in a radical different way than humans do. Essentially, God is such that he experiences all of time all at once in an eternal instant. So, and again, this is an analog to Platinian reasoning, where nous and the one, even to a certain sense, soul is outside of time. So here are two timelines, two ways of experiencing time. All right, so this is how humans and everything in physical creation experience time. We experience time in tiny little slices that always flow in one direction, that we don't have control over the flow, and we are just at one specific time slice at a time. So we could say this is T1, and this is T2, and this is T3, T4, and dot, dot, dot. And that's how time works for created beings. For eternal beings, especially God, but to a lesser degree also angels. So for God experiences all of time simultaneously. And therefore, God takes in the entire timeline of creation all at once. This innovation explains to people like Augustine why God can be a source of prophecy, because God already is right here at time slice 123 and can share with someone at time slice 3 what he knows and perceives about time slice 123 that he sees at the same time. And that's why God is, was, and always will be, is because he experiences all these things all at once. Some Christians also think that this is a way for God to have infallible knowledge about the future without God being directly responsible for everything that happens in the future. Because God isn't causing whatever happens at time slice T123. God is merely perceiving it because he's actually there. Much the same way that nobody thinks it's weird that God can perceive what's happening in Asia right now, because it's supposed to refer to the idea of an omnipresent being. So all that to say, these ideas in the Aeneas surface elsewhere in Augustine's thoughts and has theological echoes to this very day. Yeah, I gotta find a better edition of the symposium because this is not a reader-friendly version I've got here. So this selection from the symposium, which is not the whole of Plato's Symposium, is Socrates' speech. So let me give some context for the symposium. The symposium, supposedly, it has a story behind it. And the story is something like this. Socrates and some other people are going to a party. The party is at Agathon's house. Agathon is an ancient tragedian, which means he's a playwright who writes tragedies. And according to the story, Agathon has just won a contest, basically for best tragedy. And at this event, there are a group of other people, Pausanias, Agathon's same-sex lover. Socrates is invited. He's our sort of philosophical hero. Ricomachus, and I'm not going to spell this correctly, who is basically an ancient doctor. Aristophanes. People who study, philosophers who study ancient philosophy usually have a particular dislike of Aristophanes, because Aristophanes is an ancient comedic poet who basically is someone who is partially responsible for Socrates getting executed. I'm leaving someone else. Oh, Phaedrus. Phaedrus is an aspiring politician who's preoccupied with love. At the symposium, Phaedrus is the person who suggests that love be the topic of the night's discussion. And he says, let's all give a speech about love, and each person should say what they think love is and what's so good about it. And then finally, uninvited to the party, who comes in late, drunk, and sort of troublemaking, is a character named Alcibiades, who is probably one of the most hated men in Athens. Alcibiades is an Athenian general who encouraged Athens to go to war with Sparta.
this was not a good idea because the Spartans were kind of the badass warriors of the ancient world, and Athens wasn't. This Peloponnesian War did not go well for Athens. To make things worse, Alcibiades defects during the war to the Spartan side. Later, he betrays Sparta and I believe joins the I think it was the Babylonians. It was either the Babylonians or the Assyrians. I want to say the Babylonians. So yeah, this guy's kind of a troublemaker. No ancient Athenian at this point likes Alcibiades. So there's a reason he's the butt of the joke at the end, where he comes in trashed and late and just sort of he basically, the Alcibiades character serves to display all the crassest, worst expressions of eros. So the selection I gave you focuses on Socrates' account of eros, where he gives an account of what he refers to as, what is sometimes referred to as the ladder of love. The idea is something like this. It isn't just, we all love, we naturally love physical things that are beautiful, but the beauty behind physical things ought to sort of move our affections upward on the Platonic scale, and we ought to ultimately love not just the beautiful souls connected to our human friends, but beauty itself and the giver of beauty, which on the Platonic account is the form of beauty, or sort of a descendant of the form of goodness itself. Which, of course, Augustine is going to Christianize this way of thinking about love and say, well, what's important about love is this. You know, we all humans naturally love physically, things that are physically beautiful. But we all, but it is better to love other people's souls that are connected to their bodies that are beautiful. But it is better to love sort of transcendent beauty. And of course, transcendent beauty is found, according to Augustine, in God. Therefore, even sort of the best earthly romantic relationships kind of fall short because they're still trapped within materiality. One other fun thing about this selection from the Symposium is there's a good example here of Socrates' ancient claim that he knows nothing. Did you catch that? That Socrates says, well, I don't really know anything about love. But I'm going to say a lot about love anyway, despite the fact I don't know anything about love. But I'll try to find a loophole, because I heard the priestess Diotima say these things, and what she said struck me as quite right. So despite claiming to know nothing, he basically endorses something somebody else says as the epitome of wisdom about love. There's also some interesting things about gender in here, because if you read the fuller Symposium, the early speeches and early characters give some very misogynistic accounts of love. So they say some negative things about women. But Socrates counters this by endorsing the view of love given by a woman. And there are no women actually participating in the Symposium. So to bring in the wisdom of a woman from the outside is a powerful literary device, and it's difficult to view as coincidental. It's also difficult to view it as coincidental that he picks, of course, a priestess, a heavily religious account of love. I don't know. Thoughts on any of this? Questions about any of this? Yes.
Aristophanes, so I've read Clouds, the play. Are they just like on speaking terms here, or like? And I guess in the play, he's not exactly. I mean, he's roasting Socrates in a sense, but also not, like, it leads to his death, but maybe it's not as intense. So are they, like, what is the nature of their relationship?
Well, the thing you have to remember about Platonic dialogues is that most of them are not meant to be taken historically. And there are cues in the different dialogues as to how historically they might or might not be. One of the interesting features of this dialogue that I hadn't mentioned is this dialogue is given as basically a third, as a story heard from somebody who heard it from somebody else. So there are sometimes in the Platonic dialogues they say, very directly, Plato was there, and he's one of the characters, or that he's telling the story directly, or somebody very closely associated with Socrates. In this particular account, there are things that distance it from real history. So for one thing, it's very unlikely that this group of characters would have been together. Alcibiades would not have been there at this point, because everybody already hates Alcibiades, and he wouldn't dare show his face in Athens because they would lynch him after he turned coat and betrayed him during the Peloponnesian War. So this is more like, frankly, a Saturday Night Live skit than real history. Some of the Platonic dialogues are a little more historic, in which case we might call what Hollywood would say is based on a true story. In which case, 30% of it's true instead of 10%. But it's probably true that Agathon won a competition for ancient tragedies, and several of his friends were there, and maybe Socrates was there. I don't know much more about the direct relationship between Aristophanes and Socrates. Although I think it's fair to say that the depiction of Socrates in the clouds would have been interpreted as negative enough in the day that wouldn't be a basis for much of a friendship. I mean, imagine like being Donald Trump and watching like one of these really negative Saturday Night Live skits that's just mocking him and roasting him. I mean, they're not doing it out of friendship, and that's not subtle. And that's probably how Socrates would have felt about Aristophanes. One part that I did not include is Aristophanes gives the oldest version that I'm aware of the soulmate myth. So Aristophanes says, I know where love comes from. And he gives this sort of primordial story of the origins of love. And he says humans in their original form were spherical, and they were self-satisfied in their completeness. And they had hubris towards the gods as the result of this. And Zeus splits them in half as the result of their hubris. And that's why on Earth, people are always looking for their soulmates, their lost other half of their soul. So that idea of soulmates isn't from Disney, you all know. That's a very old idea that goes at least as far back as the Symposium. And again, that particular story is full of these sort of comic, exaggerated, ridiculous images, the idea of humans being spherical. I mean, And then he even has an account of where heterosexuality and homosexuality comes from, and sort of different breaking of the original spheres. Anything else in the
Just the connection between where you were mentioning Socrates saying he knows nothing. Where does that come in with Augustine?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, you could compare this to, although I've never seen it directly referenced, you could compare this to sort of the idea of original holiness, that all of human knowledge is tainted and uncertain and, on our own at least, deeply flawed. So, that certainly seems like a plausible connection, although I can't think of any places where he cites that directly. Sure. But yeah, the more Augustine you read, and I've read some Augustine. Look, there's 100 books by Augustine. I've read like 5.
I mean, so I've read some Augustine. When it comes to the medievals, I'm actually more of an Aquinas expert. But yeah, the more Augustine I read, the more you see sort of analogous patterns of reasoning between Plato and Augustine.
This might be way too intensive a question and maybe doesn't have an answer, but that whole like Socratic paradox of the wise, I have no knowledge or whatever. What is like the point of that? Is there like a?
I think the point is humility.
Okay.
I mean, the point is something like this. The ongoing search for wisdom is critical for the philosophical life. One of the most dangerous things you can do is believe you've got it all figured out, especially at a young age. It is very unlikely that you, in fact, have it all figured out. The older you get, the more experience you get, and the more oddities you notice in life. In fact, Socrates in the Republic, Plato in the Republic says, philosophy is something people shouldn't learn until they're older, like much older, like 50 or 60, because you need some life experience to understand the importance of philosophy, which is why younger people just think it's a bunch of mental gymnastics. But like one of the most fun classes I ever taught, I taught one summer at a community college. I had all these older nurses who were going for like higher nursing certifications, and they needed an ethics class. And those nurses understood the significance of every ethical issue I threw out there, because they would always have these stories about, this one time they had this person and the family wanted to do this and the person wanted to do that. And the doctor gave them this piece of information, but having the information actually made them worse off. And they understand that these aren't just, mind puzzles that us philosophers come up with, but there are real life implications of the positions people take on philosophical issues. So that was one of the most fun classes I taught. So all that to say, the point of knowing nothing is A, a point of humility, and maybe B, a point about the human condition. That being said, one of the funny jokes about Socrates is if you read enough of the Platonic dialogues, is he sure seems to know an awful lot for a guy that goes around claiming to know nothing. All right, now remind me, who's doing the book 2 discussion on Friday? All right, so how are we progressing with that?
You have a good start on the handout.
Good.
Get that to you tonight.
Good, I'll take a look at it and get you some feedback. And also include some times tomorrow where we could like video chat or something. All right, very good. All right, on that note, thank you all. We'll have our student-led discussion on Friday. You're welcome. You too. Happy Wednesday.